When Dr. Mohamed Abdou joined Columbia University, he was thrilled to be in the company of renowned scholars of the Middle East.
We were talking about some of the most preeminent scholars, from Joseph Mas'at to Rashid Khalidi to Nadia Abul-Hajj, Leila Abul-Aghoud, Mahmoud Mamdani. The list is quite extensive.
What he didn't expect was that just about 4 months into the position, he would learn of what Columbia called his termination via a congressional hearing broadcast on live TV.
He will never work at Columbia again.
This is Beyond the Headlines, and I'm your host for this week, Yasmin Al-Taji. On this episode, we're peering into a quieter remnant of anti-war protests that shook college campuses in the U.S. and around the world last spring. From pitched tents to class walkouts to boycotts and petitions, students made demands of their universities, at the core of them, divestment from Israel. Quiet firings, ongoing disciplinary action, and pending lawsuits have cropped up since. We're hearing from 2 university employees and their lawyers about what happened and what comes next.
So he has been terminated? He has been terminated. And not just terminated, but his files will show that he will never work at Columbia again.
That's Columbia University's then president, Minouche Shafik, speaking at a congressional hearing by the Education Committee in April this year. Shafik has since resigned. She's talking about Dr. Abdou, whom we heard from briefly a bit earlier. It's a response to a question from a House representative about a Facebook post Abdou made shortly after the October 7th Hamas attacks on southern Israel. Across the United States, several professors and various staff at universities say they're facing disciplinary action for their support for Palestine or activism against Israel's ongoing war in Gaza. In a message, Palestine Legal, a legal aid group focusing on cases related to Palestine activism in the U.S., told The National it's received 2,900 requests related to the suppression of Palestinian rights advocacy on campuses across the U.S. since October 7th, 2023. There was no shortage of those claims by the spring of 2024. On Columbia's campus, it was a time of tension and frustration, but also life and community. Students had packed onto the main lawn in protest of the university's administration, sharing meals, words, and music in a space that came to be known as the Gaza Solidarity Encampment, ultimately prompting 2 mass arrests on the private campus.
Let's go! Keep walking! Let's go!
The student action sparked a global movement in protest of Israel's war in Gaza. Dr. Abdou was among them. As a visiting professor at Columbia University's Department of Muslim Societies, he supported his students in their protests demanding the university divest from Israel as its war in Gaza raged on.
I was at the encampment watching my students get arrested. These are my students that I should, as a professor, be the first line of defense. And yet I couldn't do anything.
The campus protest movement at Columbia began soon after Israel launched its war on Gaza following that Hamas attack on October 7th that killed around 1,200 people. In response to the protests at Columbia and across the country, a congressional committee overseeing education began probes investigating anti-Semitism on college campuses. At a hearing on Columbia, Representative Elise Stefanik of New York probed the university's then-president Minouche Shafik about a Facebook post Abdou had made days after the October 7th attack. It's still up today with just over 20 likes, but it was enough for a right-wing newspaper, the Washington Free Beacon, to report on it, and for the House committee to take notice. Here's Stefanik, who has since become Donald Trump's choice for UN ambassador, speaking at that April hearing.
Let me bring your attention to Mohamed Abdou, who was hired after the October 7th terrorist attack against Israel.
And this is Shafik.
Faculty who make remarks that cross the line in terms of anti-Semitism, there will be consequences for them.
What are the consequences in this case?
I have 5 cases at the moment who have either been either taken out of the classroom or dismissed.
And is he one of those?
He will never work at Columbia again. So he has been terminated? He has been terminated. And not just terminated, but his files will show that he will never work at Columbia again.
Now he's suing Columbia and Shafiq for defamation and violations of various rights in the state of New York. Abdu said he never received any notice of termination from Columbia, nor had he ever received any warnings prior. And according to Abdu and his attorney, he was hired in May of 2023, before the war in Gaza began, for a term beginning in January of 2024. Columbia University representatives declined to comment, citing pending litigation. As of the time of this episode's publication, defense attorneys representing both the university and Shafiq did not respond to requests for comment. The defense moved to dismiss the case, which is awaiting assignment of a judge.
I didn't face any negative attitude or pushback whatsoever. Till this moment that we're speaking now, I have not been notified of a single investigation insofar as Columbia, or have I had a single correspondence from Columbia University. But my exact quotation, as a matter of fact, was, yes, I support the Muqawma and I named the Muqawma. However, I have strategic differences with the Muqawma because I'm somebody who teaches and argues against any form of hierarchies, authoritarianism, sexism, queerphobia, and so on and so forth.
Meanwhile, on a campus just outside of Chicago, these are the sounds of a similar encampment set up at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois. It's the start of a story where a university charges 3 of its employees and a graduate student with Class A misdemeanors, the highest category in the state, with severe penalties, including fines of up to $2,500. The alleged offense? Resisting or obstructing a peace officer.
And so I, got in my car, came over to support the students.
One of those who was initially charged is Josh Hahn, a librarian who's worked at Northwestern for 13 years. He was off the clock when he saw police presence at the student encampment and decided to join in.
Really, it was just out of an abundance of care for the students and to protect them. The
charges were brought by the Northwestern University Police Department, or NUPD, in June, months after the encampment was removed and most people began going home for the summer. Here's Hahn again, describing what began to happen at that point.
We started to receive phone calls, a few of us from NUPD, and these phone calls were extremely, extremely vague. They wouldn't tell me particular if I was being investigated. They wouldn't tell me what this was about. They were citing privacy concerns, and they were asking me to come in and pick up paperwork. And I said, what kind of paperwork? They wouldn't tell me. I said, do I have to come in and pick up this paperwork? And they said no. And I said, well, then I'm not going to do it. 2 days later, they just showed up unannounced at my office space, opened the door with their all access key card without knocking, detained me, read me my rights. I declined to say anything.
Illinois' Cook County, which was overseeing the case, eventually dropped the charges, citing their policy not to prosecute peaceful protesters. Then, the university launched its own internal probe. Hahn received a notice for an investigative discussion, quote, regarding the events that occurred on Deering Meadow the morning of Thursday, April 25th, unquote, at the encampment. Deering Meadow is considered the university's main lawn. That investigation ended with a final written warning to Hahn, the highest warning he can get before corrective action is taken should he violate any measure related to this case, up to termination. The National contacted Northwestern University. Spokesperson John Yates told The National the university does not comment on personnel matters. The House Committee on Education and Workforce continues to press universities where protests took place, an accusation it doubled down on in an October report, naming universities across the country, including Columbia and Northwestern. Some of those who say they were disciplined because of their stance on Palestine have filed lawsuits. Abdu is one of them. Legal implications can be different depending on whether a school is private or public. Because these two universities are private, Abdu's and Hahn's cases aren't First Amendment cases, which would cite the constitutional right to freedom of speech. But they could fall under civil rights and discrimination law, and something Abdu's attorney, Jonathan Wallace, calls Teski rights, applicable in the state of New York.
So there is a doctrine that started being developed by New York courts about 40 years ago, and many other states have a similar doctrine. And I refer to it in this complaint as Teski rights. It goes back to a case that New York's highest court decided in 1980, which stood for the proposition. The name of the case was Teski against Wagner College. And the case stands for the proposition that private universities like Columbia are strictly bound to keep the promises that they make in their faculty manuals and their student codes. And the Columbia Faculty Manual promises in a variety of contexts that professors will have complete academic freedom. It's kind of a built-in part of even presenting yourself to the public as a secular university.
Some professors like Abdu are now questioning whether academic freedom truly exists in the spaces and classrooms they've long called home.
I was hired precisely for my expertise, and none of that expertise was called on by Manu Shafiq during the congressional hearings.
In Chicago, Rima Capitan is an employment lawyer who's representing Josh Hahn.
And the way that discrimination comes into play is, Congress in this case is ostensibly trying to enforce Title VI and Title VII of the Civil Rights Act.
Back to private versus public universities. Private universities can still receive federal funding, and often do. In those cases, they must comply with Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, which prohibits institutions that receive federal assistance from discriminating based on race, color, or national origin. The House Committee on Education and Workforce says that the encampments and other pro-Palestinian demonstrations are anti-Semitic and therefore discriminatory.
So what Congress is saying is all of this Palestine activism is anti-Semitic, and the universities aren't doing their job in protecting students and others from discrimination. And this kind of framing is why Congress is overstepping, because a lot of the activism it's targeting has nothing to do with discrimination on its face, is clearly targeting political viewpoints, actions of a foreign government, and has nothing to do with anti-Semitism or the targeting of any religious group.
The cases at Northwestern University are an example of probes that came months after the incident in question. Capitan says this is telling of congressional influence on the university's administration. Northwestern University was also called into a hearing by that Committee on Education, and its president, Michael Schill, was subjected to the same type of questioning as Manu Shafiq and other university presidents called in.
Several of your faculty members locked arms, they scuffled with police officers, blocked the police officers on your campus.
So I will not comment on individual faculty members nor on matters.
Is it your decision and your decision alone to allow
the probes at
those
Northwestern
professors to
came within
continue to
weeks
teach
of a
students
June
under
letter from the House Education Committee to the university, restating its requests for a list of pending faculty and student disciplinary cases. Capitan believes Northwestern yielded to that pressure.
Within less than 3 weeks of that, Northwestern filed criminal charges. So clearly, the disciplinary cases were in reaction to Congress being upset about Palestine activism on campus, as opposed to Northwestern being genuinely concerned about violation of its own policies.
Northwestern University declined to comment. On campuses, protests continue, and administrations like that at Northwestern update and tighten their demonstration policies. For scholars and academics like Abdu, the goal is simple: return to the classroom.
Well, the most important thing is clearing my name. What do I hope to gain out of it? To be able to do what I've been trained to do, what I love doing.
Thanks for listening. This has been Beyond the Headlines, brought to you by The National. Our editor is Doa Farid. Our audio engineer is Arthur Edison, and I've been your host and producer, Yasmin Altaji.